Hi everyone, and welcome to Science Friday with the Claire Saltonstall Education Program. I'm Molly, the Island's Education Manager with the Trustees here on Martha's Vineyard. The Trustees is Massachusetts' largest conservation and preservation organization with 118 properties throughout the Commonwealth. So for today's lesson, we will be learning all about seaweed. This lesson is designed for upper elementary and middle school age students, and you'll need a few materials in order to follow along with me today. So the first thing that you will need is some sort of Tupperware or a tray like I have here. You'll want some tweezers or a toothpick would work as well. A pencil, an index card or a heavier piece of paper, so watercolor paper would also work. My index card is small, like the size of an index card, but your color paper could be bigger. So just a heavy piece of plain paper. Then you'll need at least 2 pieces of cardboard. Mine are cut to about the size of a piece of computer paper, but they can be smaller, especially if you're using an index card. But if you're using a larger piece of watercolor paper, then the cardboard cut to the size of that paper is what you will want. Then, taking an old t-shirt or an old bed sheet, so some sort of cotton fabric, you can cut and have it be about the size of your piece of cardboard and piece of paper. So you'll want at least 1 or 2 pieces of that cotton fabric. And then finally, for the fun part, for this activity, you will be collecting seaweed. So you'll need to go out to your local beach or coastal environment and look for some different types of seaweed. You can bring a bucket with you, collect the seaweed like I have over here in this Tupperware, and when you collect that seaweed, also put salt water into that bucket to keep your seaweed in that salt water. And that will be important for our activity and keeping that seaweed nice and fresh as we study it today. Okay, so to start with, we want to understand simply what is seaweed. So let's take a look in the bucket of the seaweed that I collected. We'll look at it closely and start to understand what is seaweed and what are the characteristics of seaweed, and try to identify the types of seaweed that I have here in this bucket. So now we're looking closely at the seaweed in our bucket here. To start with, it's important to understand that seaweeds are marine algae, and they're not aquatic plants because they do not have true roots or leaves, but they do carry out photosynthesis similar to plants. So today we are studying marine, so found in salt water, macroalgae. Let's break those words apart. So we know marine is found in salt water, and then macroalgae. Macro is something at a larger scale. So macro versus micro is something as micro, it's very small. Think of a microscope. It's microscopic. You have to see it through a microscope, and you're not able to see it with your naked eye. But the seaweed that we are looking at here is macroalgae. So we're able to see it with our naked eye and not through a microscope, or we don't need a microscope to see it. And then algae. So algae it's a general term for microscopic or larger aquatic plants that use the sun's energy to make food, photosynthesis. So algae differs from trees, bushes, and other flowering plants because they do not have true roots, stems, and leaves. And you'll see that today as we learn about the different parts of the seaweed that we've collected. Okay, so let's now take a closer look at the seaweed that I've collected here on Martha's Vineyard. How many different types of seaweed can you identify or see in this bucket? to start with, let's look at the different colors. We're seeing this seaweed here, and it has another seaweed attached to it, but this one here is a brownish, almost yellow, mustard colored seaweed. And then we're also seeing a green colored seaweed in here that's shaped quite differently than the brown seaweed. So this green seaweed, it's almost lettuce-like, which gives us a good hint as to what it is. This is the genus Ulva, and commonly we call it sea lettuce. But the seaweed we are going to be looking at closely today is this one. This is a brown algae, so a brown seaweed of the genus Fucus. And it's also commonly known as rockweed or rack. So this is our brown algae that we are going to be looking at closely next, and we'll be able to press this seaweed. Okay, so now we want to take a close look at our Fucus, our rack or rockweed seaweed, and we are going to try to identify the different parts of this seaweed. So if you have your seaweed collected, you can pull it out on your tray just like this and follow along to see if you can also identify on your pieces of seaweed these similar parts. Okay, so I've spread it out a little bit so we can get a good look at our seaweed. Now I have here a sheet that shows us the names of the different parts of the seaweed. So to start with, let's look here at holdfast. Can you guess what purpose the holdfast has and what does it do for the seaweed? This holdfast, which is down here, look at the shape of our seaweed compared to our diagram, down at the bottom here. So the holdfast helps to keep the seaweed anchored. If it's going to be attached to a rock or some sand, some substrate, that holdfast there is what allows that seaweed to stay in a certain spot, and it won't be pushed away by waves and all the action that's happening at the beach. So down here is where we have our holdfast. See if you can find the holdfast on your piece of seaweed as well. Now let's look for our next part of the seaweed. How about the stipe? Here. Looks like the stipe on ours is here. Just very similar to a plant or a tree. It's almost like the trunk of that seaweed. So it's like a stem. And this stipe then leads us to more or less the branches of the seaweed. But they aren't true branches like on a plant you'd find on land, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Next, let's look for the blades. So the blades are just like leaves. We're all familiar with leaves on trees and plants. So these blades of our seaweed, which I'll hold it up a little closer, are these flat areas here, which do almost look like leaves in a way, right? So these blades, they play an important role for the seaweed. They're long and broad in order to collect as much sunlight as possible for photosynthesis. So these are the blades. So the stipe and the blades of the seaweed make up the frond. So these sections are the fronds of the seaweed. So a stipe like a stem, blades like leaves, and that frond is the combined section of that seaweed. Finally, the fun part. How about the bladder? What do you think these bladders do for the seaweed? Can you take a guess? They are these little circles that you're seeing on the seaweed. These bladders are very important. In most seaweeds, these are air sacs. So the bladders have air inside them, and it helps the seaweed, as imagine the seaweed is attached to the bottom on a rock or on some sand or some surface down there. It wants to reach up like a land plant up towards the sun. So these bladders help to float the seaweed. So just like you would have a flotation, maybe a life jacket that helps you float in the water, these air bladders are helping the fronds, these blades, reach the surface of the water for sunlight because it needs sunlight to grow. So in some seaweeds, the bladders aren't just full of air. Sometimes they have, in certain times of year, a gel-like substance inside, which is used for reproduction of that seaweed. So I'm going to grab one that maybe has some bigger bladders so we can open them up and see if indeed do they have a gel-like substance inside. So there's a good look at our hold fast down here. I'll flip it over. Our hold fast with the stipe, so like a stem, up to the blades. These flat blades, they're a little bit spiraled here on this rack, up to the bladders. So now let's take one of these bigger bladders and see, is there anything inside of it? As I pop it open, and yes, there is a gel-like substance inside there. Okay, so now that we know the different parts of our seaweed, and hopefully you've been able to identify those same parts on your seaweed sample, we are now going to press our seaweed. So then after we press it, you can label the parts just like the parts are labeled on this sheet as well. So let's move on to our fun activity now. Okay, so for our activity, you'll want one piece of your seaweed where you can see your hold fast down at the bottom and the other parts that we just learned about. But you want to make sure your seaweed will fit on your index card or your watercolor paper. So what I'm going to do before I put any water into my bin here is just make sure I'll be able to fit it here. And if it seems like it's a little too big, mine feels a little big where I won't be able to spread it out enough, then look for another piece in your bucket that is maybe a little bit smaller if you've collected a good amount of the seaweed. So since my other seaweed is a little bit bigger, I found a piece that's a bit smaller and will fit better on my index card here. So now for your activity, you want to have your index card or watercolor paper there in your bin, And then take from your bucket of seaweed, take some of that salt water without trying to get too much of the other seaweed. I'm going to get some ulva in there too, and pour it into this bin. So you want to cover your seaweed with that salt water. Okay, mine is pretty much covered there. So once you have it covered, you can take your tweezers or toothpick and you're going to start arranging your seaweed on your piece of paper in the water in the way that you would like to. So I'm going to move some of the ulva off of my sheet with my toothpick. Some is connected here down at the holdfast. But I want to just put this on my sheet in a way where I would like to have it displayed, because once we press our seaweed, then that's it. That's how it will stick on your sheet. A little bit of my seaweed still might hang off because my piece of paper is a little small, so I might have to go a bit diagonal. Move some of the others. Okay. A little bit of ulva there at the bottom, but that's okay. Okay, so once you have your specimen of seaweed in the proper place that you like on your piece of paper, then take your piece of cardboard and you're going to be moving that piece of paper slowly out of the water and putting it onto the cardboard. So I'm going to slowly move it and hopefully it will stay on fairly well here. If you want to dump off any excess water that's still stuck on that piece of paper. You can even, if you have a few pieces of other seaweed or debris on the piece of paper, you can move those off with your tweezers or with your finger, whatever is easiest. Okay, when you're happy with that, then you're going to put your seaweed on your piece of cardboard. Now, we can move our tray out of the way. And we have here our sample with our piece of cardboard. Next, take a piece of your cotton, your cut cotton, and you're going to put this right over the specimen and just flat on it. This way, your seaweed won't stick to the cardboard that we're going to put again on top. And instead, it will stick to that piece of paper because now we are pressing that seaweed to that paper. Next, take your other piece of cardboard and put that on top. Great. So now we've made our seaweed sandwich here. The next thing you'll want to do is take something heavy that you have in your house. And for me, it could be as simple as taking my bucket of other seaweed and putting it there on top of my pressed seaweed. Now you're going to want to leave that pressed seaweed in that location for at least a couple of days to let it fully dry. And then once it's done drying, you can take that seaweed out of the pressed location and you can label it with the parts that we learned about together. So using this sheet as a guide, then you can look for and label with your pencil the holdfast, stipe, bladder, blades, and the frond. So I hope that you had fun today learning all about the different parts of seaweed and also completing a seaweed press along with me. You can see I have my heavy bucket of salt water here with seaweed in it pressing down on my fucus that is here within the cardboard. So I would love to see your presses in a couple days once they're nicely dried and labeled with the different parts. You can share those by just simply commenting on this video with your photograph and to tell me what you thought of doing that press. You can find more online lessons and activities just like this one at thetrustees.org/at-home. The Trustees is a nonprofit organization. That means we rely on support from people just like you and your friends and family. So I encourage you to become a member of the Trustees, to renew your membership or donate at this time. And you can do so by simply going to thetrustees.org/join us. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you next time.